my immediate left is Brendan O'Neill. Brendan is the editor of Spiked. He's also a columnist for Reason and The Spectator, the author most recently of A Duty to Offend. And most pertinently for this evening, he was banned from the University of Oxford in 2014 at a debate on abortion, where he was due to make the pro-choice case on the basis that he, as a person without a uterus, their words, wasn't sufficiently credited to contribute to that debate. So it'll be interesting to hear from Brendan. Speaking after Brendan.
My answer to the question, is the left eating itself, is no. For the simple reason that what we have on campuses in the US and the UK today is not left. This hyper-racial consciousness, this insistence on female fragility, this paranoid philistinism so that books are defaced with trigger warnings and everything from tabloid newspapers to sexy pop songs can be banned. This disavowal of your own autonomy, your own adulthood, and your pleading with bureaucracy to provide you with psychic comfort. This use of racial phrases like white men, as if all white men have the same privilege, as if class, the building block of left politics, was irrelevant or such a small thing that it didn't bear talking about. None of this is left. None of this is what I understand to be left. In fact, it has far more in common with the politics of reaction than it does with the politics of the left. It is a replay, in my view, of the carnivals of reaction that greeted the rise of Enlightenment thought, the birth of mass democracy, the liberation of women and ethnic minorities from second-class oblivion. In my view, today's campus agitators better resemble the reaction against those progressive, radical leaps forward for humankind than they do the progressive, radical leaps forward themselves. They are not left. I know this sounds like semantics, but it's incredibly important that we get this right. I know they call themselves left, but North Korea calls itself a democratic republic. People lie. And more importantly, people use progressive phrases to disguise reactionary agendas. That is a long-standing historical phenomenon, and that is what we face on campus today. The dressing up of the new reaction against Enlightenment thought as something progressive. I think what we face on campus today and across many institutions in the West is something far worse than left-on-left battles. We face the slow-motion, agonizing death of Enlightenment thought and the return of reactionary ideas. Just on why I think they are not left-wing, and we really must stop calling them left-wing, just a few examples. The first thing is that this new campus radicalism completely grates against the idea of universalism, which is one of the key ideas of left-wing politics from the French Revolution onwards. The idea of the common man, the rejection of the biology or the politics of race and the politics of division in favor of emphasizing common interests. The new radicalism completely grates against that. It does it through always emphasizing the fragility of black students, the culpability of white students who benefit from historical privilege and therefore are culpable for the crimes of history. You know, when I visit American campuses, I'm really shocked by the politics that is on offer to students. It's either black self-pity or white self-loathing. That seems to me to be the only options in radical politics on campus today. A highly racialized, hyper-racial politics. And it's really emphasized in the phrase, stay in your lane. Don't ever dare to mix too much with the other race or offer too much solidarity to the other race because you're getting above yourself. You should stay in your lane. You can also see it in the way in which this new radicalism completely grates against the idea of class. As I was saying earlier, their use of the phrase white men, this amorphous phrase, you know, white men are bad, of course, all white men are bad, even the white men who historically helped to develop the Enlightenment and radical thinking and so on. They're all bad. They're all the same, and they all enjoy privilege. It's complete negation of the idea of class, the key dividing line in modern society, and the foundation stone of left-wing politics. You can also see the way it's not left in the way it demeans women and ethnic minorities. Women are presented as fragile, as requiring Victorian-style chaperoning through daily life. They couldn't possibly negotiate the ups and downs of public life and student life and sex life on their own. You know, you think that's left-wing. Can you imagine Rosa Luxemburg or Frida Kahlo, famous communists who had affairs with all sorts of people, shrinking in case if someone offered to buy them a drink or if someone touched them on the shoulder? It's ridiculous. This is not left. They demean ethnic minorities too, with their acquiescence to the idea of microaggressions, where everyday conversation is presumed to be hurtful to certain minority groups, or their champion of the removal of certain statues or the renaming of certain buildings. I've heard radical students talk about the environmental menace of statues of old white men, as if ethnic minority students are incapable of walking past a statue without being wounded by it. It is not left to push such a demeaning racial view of certain groups in society. And in fact, what it does, it actually reinvents the biological determinism of the old racial politics, but in the language of historical determinism. They are wounded by history. So in so many different ways, this is not left. This is a reactionary, illiberal politics. And in my view, it has far more in common with the old reactionary politics, particularly the reactionary politics that emerged in the aftermath of the development of Enlightenment thought. And there was a famous reactionary 18th century French philosopher who hated the Enlightenment. He thought it was the worst thing that ever happened. And his famous line was, his name was Joseph de Maistre, his famous line was, "There is no such thing as man." He said, there are French men, there are Italian men, there are black men, there are white men, there are poor men, there are rich men, but there is no such thing as man. And whenever I hear student radicals crying about white men, black people, women, and everyone having different ideas and different views and the need to control public interaction to protect people's feelings, I always hear the echo of that anti-universal, anti-progressive, anti-radical cry. There is no such thing as man. I think what we have to recognize is that on campus right now, we face something far worse than left versus left or left versus right, or the alt-right coming in and stirring things up and left-wing people crying as a consequence. We face a generation that has been schooled to reject Enlightenment thought, schooled to reject due process, schooled to reject freedom of speech, schooled to reject the ideal of autonomy, and encouraged to see themselves as fragile and weak and requiring bureaucratic, therapeutic scaffolding in every area of their lives. That is not left. That is the opposite of left. That is the opposite of radical, and it needs to be challenged by everyone who seriously considers themselves to be a left-wing person.
Thank you, Brendan.
There we go.
And then finally, on my far left, we've be hearing from Brett Weinstein. So Brett is an evolutionary theorist and a former professor of biology at Evergreen State College. The reason he is former is the fact that, as many of you will know, he was at the centre of a big national news story when he criticised an anti-racist protest on campus, which was asking white student and faculty to stay away from the day. As a result, the subject of a lot of protests and calls for his resignation.
My professorial instincts are kicking in, and I feel like I should try to synthesize what I've been hearing and challenge a few things, but I'm going to try to stick to the plan. The plan is to address the question, is the left eating itself? And I think there are a couple of ways that we can answer this question. One is yes. Another would be, yes, of course it is. I mean, that may be my lived experience speaking here, but it seems so transparently obvious that that is what is going on, that I feel inclined really to move on to the more interesting question, which is why is the left eating itself? But that does mean that I have to address some of what's been said here. How can we disagree? If it's so obvious to me that the left is eating itself, then how am I sitting on a panel with people who are obviously well-spoken and informed, maybe more so than I am, who disagree? And I think in part it's going to come down to definitions, which could be a very semantic, dry discussion were it not for the reason that the definitions are in flux. And so I think we should probably get there soon enough. For the moment, what I want to do is suggest a kind of approach to understanding why this really is the left that is attacking some of us who all our lives would have called ourselves leftists. And the first thing I would suggest is that we may have a basic problem with the game theory of progressivism. It is quite possible that what is taking place is that the left has a bad actor problem that arises out of some of the fundamental assumptions of progressivism. And I don't mean to strike a negative note. I do think it is possible to structure a left that would be more or less immune to a bad actor problem. But what I'm witnessing in the present are bad actors that have control over the entire dialogue, and that is a very dangerous situation. The first thing that I recognized a bit before things went haywire at Evergreen, or at least went haywire publicly, was that the people I was talking to, and most of the population at Evergreen is pretty far left, but I recognized that there was a hidden dichotomy between two populations within the left. One of those populations earnestly wishes equality, and there can be some debate over what it is that is being equalized, but virtually everybody on the left would say that they are for equality of opportunity. Then there is another population that does not wish equality of opportunity. What it wishes to do is to turn the tables of oppression. And the problem for us is that when these two populations are intermingled, they sound alike until the point that you reach something like equality of opportunity, and we are nowhere near that point. At that point, they would clearly diverge, and you would discover that some of the people who had been pursuing some nominal version of equality were really about some radical version of inequity with new people at the head. And I do think that that's what we are facing. And the most confusing aspect of it is that the people who are earnestly seeking something like equality of opportunity are unaware that they have signed up with something unholy and un-American. One of the consequences of this dichotomy, the bad actors having taken control of the movement, is that they have begun to erect structures that lead a lot of people to sign up before they really know what it is that they're signing up for. So you'll find across the dialogue of the left at the moment, you'll find words that once upon a time had a definition that you might have struggled a little bit to resurrect it, but you could have figured out what words like equity probably meant. And those words have taken on very different meanings in the present. And they're actually part of a larger structure. So we have what I would call linguistic booby traps. We have policy proposals on college campuses and elsewhere that are actually Trojan horses that are described as pursuing one thing but actually serve a function other than the one that is on the title page. And then we have stigma that is playing an incentivizing role, or actually more correctly, a disincentivizing role. So people like myself who stand up against policy proposals that put my institution in jeopardy find ourselves faced with a social penalty for having done so. And it seems funny in my case. They came after me with the accusation that I was a racist, and then it turned out that there were a lot of people who could tell you that wasn't true, so it backfired on them a bit. But in fact, none of these stigmatizing concepts really depends on being accurate. The most important thing that they do is they isolate you. And that is a means to an end. These are not logical arguments that are being deployed. This is leverage that is being wielded against individuals that are considered troubling from the point of view of the movement. And I would argue that the best way to conceptualize what this movement really is to understand that we don't get to listen in on most of the actual dialogue that results in the structuring. What we listen in on is the public face of this movement. And the movement is really properly understood as an insurgency that privately has decided that it is entitled to disrupt the functioning of certain things that it regards as, quote unquote, problematic, and that once it has decided that you are problematic, there are no holds barred. If you recognize it as an insurgency and you stop listening to what it says it is attempting to accomplish, it will be much clearer what is taking place. Now maybe that's where I should leave off in light of the differences of opinion on the panel. Probably the best thing we can do is try to hash them out. But please consider thinking about this as an insurgency engaged in an action that it understands far better than those of us who are looking on from the sidelines.
Thank you, Brett.
Bing, bing, bong, bong, bing, 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 bong, bing, bing, bong.
Grab him by the pussy.
Bing, bing, bong, bing, bong. I don't care. Bing, 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 bong. China's killing us. We need to build